Hello and welcome to episode 1 of Behind the Screens. This is the series that we're going to be talking through how to be a DM or how to be a GM, what the difference between the two is, and how to tell a story. There's a bunch of content that I have in plan here, but we're going to start out with the basics. We're going to start out with the kinds of tools that you're going to need in order to be a solid game master. Now, the term Dungeon Master is one that you'll hear probably most often. That's really just the Dungeons and Dragons terminology for a game master. A game master is the person that helps narrate and create the world around the players that ultimately together tell a story. A lot of people seem to misunderstand that a DM might be the god of the game or the one that determines everything, but really what determines the entire game is a single dice. It comes down to chance, more often than not. The DM ultimately can overrule what the dice say, but for the most part, a good DM will stick to the odds of the universe. This here is a D20. The D20, as you can see, has 20 different faces. It tells you whether you've succeeded at something you're attempting to do, or if you failed. This is monumental because this is what has all the power in the game. So let's talk about these basic tools. We've already kind of hinted at one, but the first one really is going to be an entire set of dice. An entire set typically consists of 7 dice. You have a D4, which has 4 sides, a D6, which, as you guessed it, has 6 sides, a D8, which, again, 8 sides, D10s. You typically have 2 here because you have a percentage or a percentile die, and you have a standard 10-sided die. From there, you have the D12, 12-sided, and the D20. One set of dice is fine for one player. For the DM, maybe more. There are going to be several times where you're rolling a single die multiple times. So having multiple D6s, D10s, D20s, D12s can help you out a lot. It saves time. The other thing a DM can do is be really excellent and buy a set of dice for each person, each player, because dice are cheap. If you want really good ones, that's a little bit different. As a DM, I usually try to have some cheap dice on hand so that my players, if they forget theirs or if they don't have any, can just play with what I've got. They're not the best dice, they're not the most expensive dice, but they roll, and they roll fairly. The next item is this item that you're seeing right here. This is known as a Dungeon Master's screen, or a Game Master's screen, or a privacy screen. This unfolds into several panels. So in this case, I have 4, and the insides of this one, because it's a little bit fancier, have a bunch of different information. This one, for instance, has attack of opportunity triggers. This is talking about when a creature or a player may have an opportunity to do a bonus attack free of any kind of charge or anything other than, a roll of hit. This particular panel talks about the combat, such as combat rolls, armor classes, attack rolls, modifiers, and grappling, which is an important one to know because some classes really rely on grappling. The next panel has a player reference telling me life points of up to 4 players, names, levels, total basic information, as well as for the boss monster. The final panel has conditions. We're talking about poisoned, shaken, sickened, confused, dazed, what these kinds of percentages look like, how to escape them, the whole gambit. This unfolds and sits up right here. And you probably guessed it, that's why we call it Behind the Screens, because a DM doesn't want their player base to know what's happening behind this screen. You don't need to have a super expensive screen, just something that hides your die rolls. Making sure that your players don't necessarily know if this was a 1, a 4, an 18, or even a 20. You want to make sure that this stays hidden because that'll allow the DM to play around with chance a little bit and give their give their players benefit of the doubt. The goal of the DM is never to just outright kill a player. The goal of the DM is to help tell the story from the world's perspective. So if a lich or an NPC or the world would kill a player, then let it happen to a degree. But you also know when your players are new and have invested a lot of time and energy into a character that they've built over years or days or even months. Some people get attached very quickly. Pay attention to the room. Try not to kill people. It's not the role of the DM to kill people. It's the role of the DM to help them tell a great story. After you've picked up a DM screen fitting your exact desire, you're going to need a notebook and a pencil. Pencil, not pen. Why? Because you need to erase things, and pens are notorious for not liking being erased. This particular notebook that I've got is not a standard notebook. This is not paper. This is stone paper. So essentially this has been crushed down into, this is stone crushed down into powder that's then formed into pages. So it's environmentally friendly. You don't have to be this bougie. You don't have to be this crazy fancy. But I've found that I really like the quality and the feel of this paper over normal paper. If you are writing in pen for more permanent fixtures, like maybe character or NPC names, then you should be able to use gel pens on this without it bleeding whatsoever. I'm not sponsored by these people, but nice notebooks. The reason you need a good notebook and a great pencil is because, and I say great pencil, is because you need to be able to take notes. A good DM keeps track of everything that's happening on in the game so that they can have some continuity between initial characters and NPCs and end game, twists and turns, plot devices, things like that, as well as just making sure that you're keeping your players honest. Some people out there like to say, oh, well, I had 13 gold, and you come back and you say, well, you should only have 11 because remember you bought that shiny new shield or that shiny new bracer or pauldron. A notebook is imperative to helping keep your story straight and keeping it fun and kind of continuous for your players. Also recommend that your players all have their own notebooks so that they can hold their own specific things. They can keep track of their inventory more easily. They can keep track of what's important to them a lot more easily as well. For this as well, you want to have a notebook that you don't necessarily care about tearing pages out of. If you want to cut pages out or cut pieces out, passing notes to players that only learn of secrets through shifty channels or certain letters that they've received from far off connections, don't buy a super fancy notebook for the stuff that you're going to be chaffing and giving to your players, because it's likely just going to end up in a note somewhere that they end up throwing away. The next thing that you're going to need is a player's handbook. Why, you may ask? Why would I need this? Well, that's simple. You need this because you need to know how the player's going to play. The player's handbook goes through and details out all kinds of different information like character classes, character races, specific nature domain spells, ways to level up each of the character builds. And this is by no means the only way to do this. There are resources online. There are other books out there like Xanathar's Guide to Everything. There's all kinds of stuff out there for D&D specifically. Now, in other tabletop RPGs, you may not have this kind of option or have those kinds of options beyond your initial how to play the player. Remember that these are general guidelines. You could take these concepts and apply them elsewhere. That'll give you a really basic idea of how to run a campaign in general. This is how a player is generally going to find their information for leveling up or preparing new spells, or what their spell casting abilities are, what kind of hit dice they have, all the things they need to know to fill out a character sheet. The DM needs this because the DM needs to be a player first and a storyteller second. You need to know what the players need to know in order to help them have a good time. Next up, we've got the Dungeon Master's Guide. This has all the information that book didn't have. This is how to run the campaign, how to handle invading forces, how to roll enemy characters, how to roll NPCs, how to gain weight in current events such as rebellions, revolutions, overthrowings, cataclysmic events, mapping a settlement, showing different kinds of civilian areas, how to paint a picture for your players overall so that they don't know what's happening, but you're compelling them to learn more. You're pushing them into the next areas, not because you're forcing them, but because they want to find out more. There are also kinds of magical items in these tables in the back or in the middle, different kinds of origin stories, different kinds of conflicts, all kinds of magical items, and generally speaking, plot hooks, devices, and other intrigue. Having a Dungeon Master's Guide will allow you to help write that story out or write the world out initially, making sure that the players have some room to flex around. Dungeon Master's Guide is imperative to playing a good D&D game. Make sure you pick this up, make sure you read it, make sure you read the Player's Guide or the Player's Handbook. Those are the two completely necessary books to play a great game of D&D. If you want to pick up other books and things like that, I've got a couple more that I recommend. One is more generic and one is really helpful in building out this universe, especially for high fantasy. So the next one is the Monster Manual. The Monster Manual is, as you probably guessed it, a book all about creatures, talking about all kinds of different animals, beings, demons, infernals, primordials, etc. This is everything that you can imagine that the characters could fight, from aboleths to Medusa, mephits, minotaurs, mind flayers, sphinxes, thri-kreen, umber hulks, all kinds of different creatures, and gives you all of their stat blocks and their understanding. This particular book is optional because there are so many resources out there on the internet that have this kind of information. Xanathar's Guide to Everything also has some specifics that allow you to bring in more manuals as well. The Monster Manual is a great lookup reference really quickly. It's alphabetized. It's really easy to search through and find things. That being said, there are other tools out there, such as the website Roll20, that also play a huge role in finding new homebrew things, which are content that other creators have made that are not Wizards of the Coast and they're not officially licensed. But it gives you a great jumping off point to getting familiar with what you can expect for different levels of different creatures. You don't want to start your level 2 characters or player characters out up against something like an aboleth, or in this case, a beholder. Yeah. Next book. And this is not one you need to study heavily up front. This is just an example book as well. This is Out of the Abyss. This is a campaign book. This is a pre-baked campaign book made by Wizards of the Coast that's published specifically so that you don't have to have a ton of creativity. If you have trouble coming up with what a story or what a world should look like, this kind of book will go through and detail out every little thing that you need to tell the players in these purple areas, as well as all of the detail for when they run perception checks and verifications, looking at who's a key player in the plot line, and really gives you some flexibility on where to go outside of this realm. When they are in this story, when the characters are living out and walking these paths, being able to direct them in a way that leads them back to key characters that they haven't killed, murder hobos exist, is really helpful. So a campaign book for the first couple of times that you want to run a campaign, I would say that this is a really handy tool. But again, not necessary. That's really all you need to get started with a couple of optional things there. But there are a couple other optional things that we can discuss. Things like miniatures. Miniatures are these little guys right here. A miniature is just a representation of something that would be larger in the real world. Real world. Wow, I can't speak. This particular one I 3D printed because I happen to have a 3D printer and access to it on a regular basis. But if you can't, you can buy these in booster packs, much like you would find in common trading card games. They come in randoms that you don't know what you're getting, but you can buy them in themes. If you don't want to do that, you can also buy them off of websites like Hero Forge, albeit they can be a little bit pricey if you start looking at the custom ones. This one I haven't painted yet. I intend to at some point, but I haven't gotten there yet. This is my character that I'm playing in the Descent into Avernus campaign at the moment that I am not DMing, but I really, really, really thoroughly enjoy this particular character. This is Ergonasi Cleric with a bow. Really fun campaign. You can also buy or build or design 3D models and miniatures like this. This is a house, or a tavern, or a bar, or just a hotel, or something along those lines. This particular one is a little bit more modular. It allows me to stack. There's also a foundation piece that I don't have with me at the moment. It's in the other room. But this gives people a general idea of what the aesthetic of the town is. If you're not a very good two-dimensional artist, these are a great option. Again, if you have a 3D printer, the possibilities are endless. If you don't, though, see if you can find somebody that does, because these kinds of miniatures can be quite expensive. Quite expensive. Finally, we come to the largest optional item that is also very, very useful. Excuse my mess. This is a map, as you could probably tell. A map is exactly what it sounds like. It gives a relative idea of orientation, distance between a miniature or a character or a piece of Cheeto or something like that that could represent a character, and their enemies. Their enemy could be, say, this D12. The D12 is over in this room here, and my character is here. Well, we have to pass through this door, and it is 5 feet, 5 feet, 5 feet, 5 feet. So we're talking 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35 feet to this. And my character's speed is only 30. These squares are very common. They are 25 centimeters, or sorry, 25 millimeters, or roughly about 1 inch square. And they represent 5 feet in the game. So when you have a character that is 30-foot speed, it's important to know that that means that they can move 6 squares. A map is incredibly useful for setting orientation, for getting an idea of where enemies are, for alignments, for just visualization of what characters would commonly know. So many great things. Each map is different in its care instructions. Some of them are wet erase, some of them are more rigid in their dry erase. Pay attention to that, because otherwise you can ruin your map and it can be very, very difficult to maintain afterward. This particular one is an Infinidungeon that I kickstarted on Kickstarter. And this is a wet erase, which makes sense because we want to be able to roll it up and unroll it. So this is a great tool to have for any DM. I suggest picking up a solid map rollout if you can. If you can't, that's fine. Pick up a piece of or pick up some whiteboard or something like that, and give people a general idea. Or use MS Paint on a TV or on a monitor or something like that. You'd be surprised at how much use you can get out of that. And that's about it. These are the basic tools and concepts that you're going to need to follow in order to be able to play the game. I'll give you one last little tidbit to understand about being a DM. And it comes down to a mentality. I know I touched on it earlier, but this is what runs the game right here. Dice. If you're looking at playing this game and you think, oh, I'm going to be a DM that attempts to kill my players, or I'm going to be a DM that's ruthless or overly benevolent, remember that can really inhibit the story and inhibit the success of the players more so than anything. You want to make sure that your characters are having fun and your players are jumping in and engaging in the story. They're not going to want to play a story that you've written out every detail of and you've railroaded them towards, no matter how cool a story may be. You want to write a world, or you want to build a world in a universe that they get to write the story in. They get to follow the events, they get to chase down the bad guy, or be the bad guy that gets chased down, and really enact every single plot line of their own hero's tale. If you write it all for them, it's really just them reading an overly complicated book that's really hard to schedule and get around. So remember, you're not a god in this game. You're merely a narrator in a story that hasn't been written yet. Thanks for watching this one, and go out there and get ready to start building up some ideas for stories. We're going to talk about storytelling soon. We're going to get down some basic mechanics and understanding the player's perspective so that you can be a solid DM moving forward. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, have a good one.